Hello, everyone. My name is Yoav Vaxman, and I'm a professor of economics in the Wall College of Business at Coastal Carolina University. And today we're going to talk about Lesson 7 for Econ 202 or Microeconomics. And it's going to be all about externalities. So externalities occur when an action has consequences on a third party, which is not a part of the action. It could be either a negative or a positive consequences, and that consequence is not compensated for. In the top left, you see a picture of a pelican covered with oil. This is a result of the British petroleum oil spill of 2010. That was, of course, an unintended consequences of oil drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, and that is considered a negative externality. On the top right, you have a picture of a street during Christmas, and you see that several of the houses decorated for Christmas. It just makes the neighborhood looks nicer. So when you decorate your house, you typically create a positive externality for your neighbor and for people who are visiting the neighborhood. So with no further ado, let's jump to the lesson. In this presentation, we're going to explain what externalities are and why they cause market failure. Externalities cause us to either overproduce if it's a negative externality or underproduce if it's a positive externality. So the market is not producing the ideal amount for society because the externality is not taken into consideration when choosing the market quantity. It discusses negative and positive externalities and provides multiple examples of each. We will also explain what government policies can be used to regulate externalities or to use market-based tools. And market-based tools are essentially taxes, which tax undesirable behaviors, or subsidies, which reward desirable behaviors. So the government can either try to directly control externalities through policies that are called command and control, or they can use market-based tool, which still allows individuals or companies to do what they want, but penalizes and awards specific behaviors. And finally, it examines the importance of property rights and the tragedy of the common. The tragedy of the common occurs when there's a shared resource that anyone can use and it gets overused. So at the bottom right, we see a picture of a beach on the ocean, and you can look at all the plastic that accumulated on that beach. And that is because the oceans are very difficult to control, and a lot of time trash ends up in the ocean, creating a tragedy of the common. And on the bottom left, we see a picture of an individual vaping in a restaurant. Smoking and vaping is harmful, not just for the individual, but also for the individuals who are nearby. So this is a good example of a negative externality. So what are externalities? An externality occurs when an action creates an uncompensated effect on a third party. In other words, suppose that we interact. So you sell me something and I buy something from you, but this interaction also has an effect on somebody else who is not a part of the interaction. They're called a third party. That effect can be negative or positive, but if we don't compensate that individual for the interaction, then it's considered an externality. So let's think of some examples. A negative externality includes pollution, like air pollution, water pollution, or solid waste, noise, and loss of economic value. So on the bottom left, we see a picture of traffic, and we can see the traffic creates a lot of smog in the air. And this is a negative externality because the drivers are not expected to compensate the resident of the city for the smog that they create. There are also examples of economic value loss because all that smog reduces property value in the city. So a city like New Delhi in India or Beijing, which has a lot of smog, it has lower property value because of the pollution in those cities. But there are also many examples of positive externalities, and positive externalities occur when an action has a benefit to a third party, and the third party does not have to pay for it. So a classical example of this is education. When you get educated or your children get educated, they are become better citizen. They're able to educate other people, and it has multiple positive effect on the society overall. That's why the government tends to subsidize education by providing free K-12 education and also scholarship and grant for higher education. On the bottom right, we see a picture of somebody getting vaccinated. When you are vaccinated, it benefits you because it reduces the probability you're going to get sick, or if you get sick, it reduces the probability you're going to get severe symptoms. But it also benefits society overall because if you're not getting sick and you're not transmitting a disease like measles or COVID, it benefits other people around you. So vaccinations have a positive externality, which is why government typically subsidize or provide them for free. Externalities cause market to fail because private decisions ignore social impact. So with negative externality, we produce too much of it. We should have fewer cars on the road because they create noise, smog, and traffic. And therefore, we should subsidize public transportation, which is the alternative for driving your private vehicle. On the other hand, we don't have enough vaccination without government intervention. So if the government didn't subsidize or provide them for free, most people would probably never get the flu shot, and we would have a lot more cases of flu in the winter. Let's focus on negative externalities for a minute. Air pollution from factory increases healthcare costs for nearby communities. So it's important to note that there are many types of negative externalities and they have multiple costs on society. Look at the picture at the bottom right. You see a lot of pollution in the air. This, of course, is unsightly, but also can create things like cardiovascular diseases or respiratory illnesses. If there's constant air pollution, for instance, from a paper mill or a power plant, that reduces the value of the houses in the community. So there's a healthcare cost, perhaps an impact on tourism if it's a tourist destination, and also reduction in property value. Agricultural runoff provide another example of a negative externality. So farmers use a lot of pesticides and herbicide, but all and fertilizers, but all those chemicals will end up in the watershed. It's really hard to control the spread of those chemicals and are likely to end up in the local streams and river. And the best example of this in the United States is the Mississippi and Missouri River. This is the biggest watershed system in North America, and it covers roughly 40% of the contingent United States, not counting Alaska and Hawaii. So the Mississippi and Missouri River and all their tributaries go through the heartland of the United States, where there are a lot of farming going on. And they collect a lot of chemicals like fertilizer, pesticides, and all that stuff ends up in the Mississippi River and makes its way to the Gulf of Mexico. This in turn creates algae bloom. Algae feeds on phosphorus and some of the other chemicals that we find in particularly fertilizers. When the algae bloom, it blocks off oxygen, creating what we call a dead zone. And many of the fish and other marine animal will die off. So at the bottom left, we see a picture from the Gulf of Mexico, and we can see all these dead fish washed onto the shore. As you can imagine, the smell is pretty bad. It also is a detraction for tourists. There are a lot of tourist destinations along the Gulf of Mexico, and it hurts the fishing industry. Now, the farmers are not expected to compensate for the harm that they cause the fishing industry and the tourism industry in the Gulf of Mexico, and therefore this is a major negative externality. On the bottom right, we see a picture of the Cuyahoga River, which had a major fire back in 1969. And this fire was caused by all the oil that was on top of the river. As you might know, oil is lighter than water, so it drifts to the top. And in this case, it was actually a spark caused by a train that started this massive fire, and it highlighted the problem with pollution. Not only is it unsightly and unhealthy, but in some cases it could lead to major disaster like fires. What kind of market failure do we see with externalities? Competitive markets produce too much output when firms ignore external costs. So on the bottom right, we see the typical supply and demand curve. Demand is downward sloping with price on the vertical or y-axis, and quantity is uh, on the x or horizontal axis. Supply is upward sloping, but here we have one additional curve. And this is to distinguish between supply, which represents the private marginal cost for the firms, and the social marginal cost, which is to the left of it. Because between those two, you have some marginal external costs. So think, for example, of paper. We consume a lot of paper for forms, newspaper, also for packaging. And that paper creates a lot of external costs because paper mill, which are shown here on the bottom left, create air pollution, water pollution, and create a lot of kind of bad smell in the air. So they impact property values and healthcare in the local community. If we accounted for that marginal cost, we should be producing less. So if you look back at the bottom right, you see there's a quantity for the market and the optimal quantity. And the optimal quantity with a negative externality is always smaller than the quantity the market provides. In fact, the externality creates a deadweight loss, which means an overall loss to society, which is marked by the gray triangle. If you had to measure that deadweight loss, you have to take the base of the triangle, multiply it by the height, and divide by 2. The market price is too low and the quantity is too high without government intervention. So if we were to fix this problem, if you look at the graph on the right, price should increase from $5 to $6 to reflect that external cost. And hopefully that additional tax revenue that we collect can be used to reduce the damage from the externality for the local community. Now, the government can choose different policies to try to manage externalities, and a common policy is called command control. And the idea behind command control is pretty simple, and that's basically you tell companies or people not to do certain things, and you penalize them if they do those things. So, for instance, the government has speed limits. And if you exceed the speed limit, you can be fined, or in extreme cases, you could be even jailed. So you get penalized for violating the rules that the government sets. But they also have similar rules for externalities like pollution. For instance, the Environment Protection Agency set pollution level for a specific pollutant. This is based on scientific evidence as to how much harm the pollution creates. And every pollutant has what we call a threshold level. So a threshold level is what the EPA calculate is the lowest level in which the pollutant starts creating harm. Our bodies are able to process a certain amount of pollution, but above a certain level, it creates some significant healthcare costs. Now, firms or individuals that don't comply by these standards can be penalized. However, enforcement is very expensive. For one thing, with some pollutant, like if you think of a pollutant from cars, it's really hard to detect the amount of pollution that each car emits. And because enforcement is expensive, it's not always executed. Regulation reduce pollution but provide limited incentive for innovation. So if we just tell companies to control pollution, they really don't have the incentive to, once they reach that level, to become innovative and find ways to be cleaner and more efficient. Moreover, industries may lobby for favorable rules, causing inefficiencies. So at the bottom left, we see a common command and control policy. There's no smoking at airports and certainly no smoking on airplane. Some of you who are younger may be surprised to hear that in the past, we used to have smoking in airports and airplanes and even in hospital. But over time, we realized that smoking is very harmful. It has what we call secondhand smoking, which means people who are not smoking are also impacted as if they're around smoke. So now we prohibit smoking in most public places. And on the bottom right, we see a cartoon, and it says it's about the pipeline and whether we should approve an oil pipeline. And there's the congressmen are joking to say, "What's the big fuss? We already have a pipeline." And that pipeline is really money coming in from donors and lobbyists that support congressmen. If you are a senator or representative, you typically need to collect money to run your campaign unless you're very wealthy and use your own money. And that means you owe oil companies and the NRA and other organizations, you owe them support, which could mean approving new pipelines or approving excavation in sensitive places like the National Refuge. So congressmen are not only influenced by voters, they're also influenced by lobbyists who provide money to support their campaign. There is an alternative to command and control, and those are called market-based policies. So market-based policies do not prohibit certain behavior, but they try to internalize the external costs to reduce emission and other negative externalities. What does it mean to internalize? It means that the company will now have to pay for the external costs. An example of this would be sales tax on harmful goods. So think of the high sales tax we have on things like cigarettes, alcohol, and in many countries, gasoline. The sales tax has multiple effects. It lowers production because people buy less of those products if they're a bit more expensive. It lowers consumption, of course, so it reduces the externality. It's therefore called a sin tax because these things have a harmful effect. And it may lead to what we call double dividends. So double dividends means that there are two benefits from the tax. The first one is that the government raises revenue, and the second one that they reduce an undesirable behavior. So if you think about taxing cigarettes, which most states do quite heavily, there are two benefits. The government is collecting revenue, which then can be used, for example, to compensate and people who were hurt by cigarette smoke or for another positive end. But they're also reducing the amount of smokers, which has an overall positive effect on the society. So if we look at the graph on the bottom right, we see once again the supply, but now we have supply with a tax. So now companies like cigarette producers or alcohol producers have to account for that tax when they produce and increases their cost of production. The government collects a certain amount of revenue, which is denoted in the area in blue. Consumer surplus does go down because now we have fewer smokers, and producer surplus does go down, but we eliminate a lot of the external costs. So there is an overall benefit to society by creating government revenue and also reducing some of the costs of the emission or pollution. There is a third alternative, which is also a type of market-based policy that is becoming increasingly popular. This is called a cap and trade. The government sets a pollution cap, which is saying it can only emit so much carbon dioxide or sulfur dioxide or whatever the harmful emission is. And then they provide tradable permits allowing companies to emit a certain amount of that chemical or polluter. Now, firms have to buy these permits. So if you think of a power plant that uses coal, they are producing a lot of sulfur dioxide, a lot of carbon dioxide, so they will need to buy permits to create that pollution. However, if they become more efficient, for instance, by filtering some of the smog from their pipes or switching to renewable energy, which creates far less pollution, then they can sell some of those extra permits and make profit. This provides incentive for companies to innovate and constantly become cleaner. Examples of this include the sulfur dioxide trading market in the United States and the European carbon market. So on the bottom left, we see the cost of emission in Europe. When this program first started, the cost of these tradable permits was fairly high. Then we saw the cost go down. And in recent years, as government became more strict, partly due to the Paris Agreement, which enforced strict rules about goals for emission, we see that cost go up again. And on the bottom right, we see an illustration of the carbon market. Emitter 2 is more efficient and they're able to emit less. So they have some extra permits that they can sell in the carbon market for emitter A. So there are now two reasons to reduce emission. One is if your emission is too high, you have to buy permit, and that becomes a net cost. However, if your emission is lower, you can sell permit, and that becomes a net benefit to the company. Now, in order to reduce emission, it's important to have well-defined property right. In fact, there's an economist by the name of Ronald Coase who argued that if you had clear property right, you can reduce or even eliminate many of these externalities. However, this required several things, including symmetric information, which means that both the people who emit or create the externality and the people who suffer from the externality understand the costs and benefits. And it requires communication. Now, this could be difficult in a case where there are many emitters or many individuals that suffer from emission. So if you think of car emission, well, there are many cars on the road and there are many individuals in the community that suffer from car emission, which makes negotiation very difficult and costly. If an individual own environmental resource, they can negotiate with polluters. So on the bottom right, we see a very interesting pie chart, and that shows you that roughly 58% of the forests in the United States are privately owned. Some of it is by corporation, but much of it is by individuals. This may seem like a bad thing to have individual own forest, but the reality is that individuals have the incentive to keep the forest clean, where if the forest was in the public domain and without government regulation, there would be incentive to come down, cut down the trees, or maybe throw trash into the forest. So by defining the property right around that forest, we're likely to reduce pollution and therefore reduce externalities. There's a phenomenon known as Coasian bargaining, which is illustrated on the bottom left. The idea is that you have some property dispute and it's resolved. It can be resolved amicably without any external cost if the individuals can come and negotiate. And what I mean by property dispute is, for instance, you might be burning leaf in your backyard, but it affects somebody else's property because they're downwind from you and they get all the smoke. So you can negotiate some agreement where you stop burning your leaf and they give you something else in exchange, like maybe they cut your grass once a week. Now, this negotiation in reality is very difficult, which is why many times we see people suing other people or suing companies. In the United States, suing has kind of become the default way to resolve these externalities. And many times we see what's called class suit, where multiple individuals sue a company for, let's say, polluting a lake or emitting pollution into the air. Lack of enforcement or high costs prevents agreements, which is why lawsuits tend to be the default in the US. When we study environmental economics, one of the commonly told story is what's called the tragedy of the common. This occurs when there's a common resources that is accessible to everyone, and it's either impossible or prohibitively expensive to prevent people from using it. So the story goes that there is a common or an area with grass that people can graze on. And every farmer, as you can see from the illustration on the bottom left, would want to have more cow graze on that common. After all, they're not paying for the common use, and the common is open for everyone. But as farmers add more and more cows, eventually the cows overgraze, which means they graze at a rate that doesn't allow the grass to grow up back, and eventually the soil deteriorates and the land could potentially become a desert, which is the picture we see on the bottom right. The picture on the bottom right is from an area called the Sahel, which is just south of the Sahara Desert. And due predominantly to overgrazing and overcultivation, this area is gradually becoming a desert. And once it becomes a desert, it's very, very difficult to make it an arable or a farming worthy land once again. Another example of this is overfishing. Overfishing occurs when nobody owns a given fishery or a given area in the ocean, and there's really no way to manage it. This is true for international water. Every country controls the 200 nautical miles off its shore. But anything beyond that is considered international water, and fishermen can multiple countries like China or the Philippines, the United States, Norway, all big fishing nation, can come and fish in these areas. And eventually, if too many fish are taken out, the fishery can collapse and the species can die out. So we need international agreement to manage things that are not controlled by any country, such as international water and also space. You may not think of space as a resource, but we're constantly putting more satellite in space. And there's a good question on what happens when there are too many satellites and they start colliding with one another and potentially coming back to Earth and hurting people. So there's a need to regulate these global resources, and that's part of what we do when we create global agreement. Clear property rights or regulation can help prevent depletion. There are multiple benefits for environmental protection. Obviously, cleaner air improves health, but it also reduces medical costs by trillions of dollars. So in the United States, we've been quite successful in cleaning our air. We used to have a lot more smog in the air, but thanks to cleaner cars and strict pollution regulation, we reduced the amount of sulfur dioxide and other pollutant in the air. If you think about air pollution, it doesn't only affect individual, it also affects farms. It reduces pharmaceutical output. So if you look at the 1970s and 80s, we used to have a lot of acid rain. Acid rain is not as bad as it sounds, it doesn't really hurt individuals, but it can affect crop and reduce agricultural production. We also had the Deep Horizon spill in 2010, and you can see at the bottom left, we have a picture of the cleanup for the beaches. This created an enormous external cost for tourism in the Gulf of Mexico, the fishery industries, and for individuals' health as well. Clean areas raise property value and increase neighborhood attractiveness. Everyone, or pretty much everyone, wants to live in a clean neighborhood where the air is clean, where the water is safe, and that's why we need environmental protection. They create positive externalities. So whereas emission creates negative externality, environment protection and proper regulation creates positive externalities. And increasingly, ecotourism generates revenue to preserve natural habitat and wildlife. So there are examples of this, like the Galapagos Island, which are off the coast of Ecuador. They have a lot of unique animals, like large iguanas that can swim in the ocean and giant tortoises, and they attract tourists. And so does countries like Kenya, which which attracts tourism for wildlife viewing. But it comes with a cost because tourism does affect the animal's behavior. And it's important to try to regulate tourism so the tourists don't disturb the animals or change their habits by, let's say, feeding them. When we think about environment regulation, we have to think about the marginal cost and marginal benefit. So at the bottom left, we see a graph with marginal analysis. Marginal analysis is when we think about the additional cost, the marginal cost, and the additional benefit, the marginal benefit of anything. And we can think of environment protection as one of them. As we increase the environment protection, we see more and more benefit. But the marginal benefit or the additional benefit decreases. So think about a lake that's polluted, and the government comes in and says, okay, you have to clean this lake. When we start cleaning it, the marginal benefits are quite high. We're going from having a very rancid smelling lake to having a decent lake that we can look at. As we continue cleaning it, maybe we can now start fishing in the lake. As the lake gets cleaner, we can swim in the lake. But the benefit gets small and small. And eventually, the marginal benefit becomes fairly small. On the other hand, the marginal cost of cleaning the lake increases. So at the beginning, we're going to use some of the most cost-effective ways to clean the lake, perhaps by putting a filter at the end of the pipe that emits the pollution into the lake. But as we increase environment protection, we have to find more and more expensive ways to clean the lake, for example, like going in with boats and actually physically clean the water. We're going to get to a point eventually shown in the graph where the marginal cost of an additional environment protection exceeds the marginal benefit. And economists argue that that's where you should stop. You should continue for environment protection as long as the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost. Government use what's called a cost-benefit analysis to set targets and decide on the appropriate level of environment protection. We don't need zero pollution in the air. We just have to think about the cost and benefit. So think about the cost and benefit of cleaning a beach. How often should we do it? Well, a clean beach attracts tourists and increases property value. But do we need to clean every day or every week? What the government will do is look at the cost of cleaning the beach and compare it to the expected benefit. Ideally, of course, the benefit should exceed the cost. And the higher the benefit to cost ratio, the more beneficial the project is. And that's one of the things environmental economists do. They do cost benefit analysis for environmental projects like beach cleanup, cleaning up lake, or investing in renewable energy. To summarize what we learned today, we learned externalities create market failure by imposing unpriced cost or benefit. Unpriced means that nobody is paying for those costs and benefit. Government can address these externalities through regulation and market incentive. So there are different approaches the government can take. For example, they could say no littering in a certain place. So obviously we want all our trash to end up in the trash bin and landfill where it can be processed. And we don't want people throwing trash on the side of the street or in the forest. So if they do those things, they should be fined. And that's called command control. But the government can also use market incentive by subsidizing desirable behavior. For example, providing incentive for people to buy electric vehicles, which create a lot less emission, or for putting solar panels on a house, and taxing undesirable behavior. For instance, taxing cigarettes, taxing emission, or taxing alcohol. This is known as a sin tax and has double dividends. It creates government revenue and reduces the undesirable behavior. Property rights and bargaining can improve outcome. However, it's important to note that it's sometimes very difficult to negotiate, especially when there are multiple polluters and multiple individuals that are affected by the pollution. Therefore, when it comes to environmental harm, a lot of time this ends up in the court system. Environment protection yields economic and social benefits. That includes things like better healthcare, more tourism, and high property values. And ecotourism provides sustainable funding for conservation. So ecotourism not only creates incentive to preserve an area, it also generates revenue. If you figure Kruger National Park, for instance, in South Africa, it creates revenue for conservation for the South African government. And at the bottom left, we see a picture again of pollution. Pollution will have multiple negative effects on society. Is it considered a negative externality? And at the bottom right, we see a picture of a park. And you can see that this park is very beautiful and provide multiple benefits to society, including ecotourism, which generate revenue for conservation. So with that, we have a couple of discussion questions to consider. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute and turn on my camera. Yeah. So let's think of a couple of questions. One of them is, how should the government balance economic growth and environment protection? So what are your thoughts? Do we need to focus more on economic growth, or we need to focus more on keeping the future sustainable for generation to come? Are marketable permit more effective than pollution taxes in reducing emission? Should we allow companies to buy and sell these permits in order to emit things like carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other harmful chemicals? And should ecotourism be expanded even if it risks disturbing the natural habitat? So I want to thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope to also see you in future episodes of this microeconomic podcast. Have a wonderful day and a productive time at Coastal Carolina.